All right, so back in the year 2000, Tom Hanks was in this movie called Castaway. And essentially what happened in this movie is he was in a plane crash, he ended up washing up on this island, and all these other packages kind of washed up with him. And he was stuck in this island by himself. And so over time, he ended up opening these packages to kind of see what he would find. And one of the things that he found in that package was a volleyball. It was a volleyball similar to this. This one's blue, that one was white. But he found this volleyball, he kind of put it to the side, kept opening other packages, and moved on. Well, eventually this volleyball ended up becoming his best friend. He ended up cutting his hand, got some blood on it, made a face on the volleyball, and he ended up becoming best friends with this volleyball that he called Wilson. And over the next 4 years, Wilson was the only friend that Tom had. And they developed such a close relationship that this is what happened when he realized that he had lost Wilson forever.
Wilson, where are you? Wilson! 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 I'm sorry! I'm sorry, Wilson! Wilson, I'm sorry! I'm sorry! Wilson! I can't! Wilson! Wilson!
You see, I think we all know what it feels like to feel alone. We've all been there at times. Whether you moved to a new town and had to go to a new school where you didn't know anybody, or maybe you believed something or had questions that other people didn't really believe in, and they made you feel like you were the only person that felt that way, and maybe you felt rejected and fear set in. Right? We all have had those feelings of feeling alone. And what tends to happen is when we have that feeling, it's not just a normal lonely feeling. Like it's almost like loneliness and fear and anxiety are all wrapped into one big emotion. And in those moments, we almost tend to believe things that aren't really true. We feel they are in the moment, but we believe they're not, but they're not really true. Those things like, you know, you're never gonna make it through, or nobody understands me. And these feelings just begin to build, and then all of a sudden this aloneness and isolation leads to even more loneliness. Now here's the problem with loneliness. Loneliness leads to a rise in things like anxiety and self-harm and depression and even suicide. You see, loneliness makes us feel hopeless. And when we feel alone, we tend to feel overwhelmed. You know, we don't know what to do. We feel like we're in this deep pit and we don't know how to get out of it. And everything just is caving in on us. And that's what loneliness ends up doing to us. And the reason that happens is because we were wired that way. That's how God created us. Now, God didn't create us so that we would feel that way, but He created us because we were supposed to be in relationship. We're not supposed to be doing life alone. And so that's why those feelings are so strong. You see, we were never meant to carry the way that we feel or what we experience or our worries all by ourselves. Those were things that we were supposed to share with other people. But what do we do in those times where it's just unavoidable? Right? You can't go through life without ever feeling alone or isolated or lonely. So what do we do in those moments? Well, believe it or not, the answer comes in what happened in the very first Easter almost 2,000 years ago and the days following that. Because if we look at that story, that'll give us a glimpse into the answer of how we find hope in the midst of this situation. So let's talk about it. All right, so let's travel back in time for a second to the very first Easter, like right after Jesus died, before He was raised from the dead. And let's think about the disciples for a second, because they were going through this same very thing that we're talking about right here of being alone and feeling left out. Because this Jesus that they've been following for the last 3 years, who they gave everything for, they left their jobs, they left their homes, they left everything and committed the last 3 years of their life to following this Jesus, was now dead. Everything that they thought was going to happen suddenly just came to an end, and now they're afraid for their life, that they're hiding out in this house. Now we know how the story ends, but they didn't really know how the story ends. And so you can imagine their surprise as they're in this house and Jesus comes back in. This guy who's been dead for the past 3 days now comes back in, and they suddenly have hope again. And then he leaves again, right? So he leaves, then he comes back, and then he leaves again. But this time it was different. This time they weren't the afraid, hiding out in a house with the door locked type of people. This time they went on to actually change the world. And what they did when Jesus left the second time went on to change human history forever. So what was it that he said, or what was it that happened during that time that made this one so different? Why did Jesus leaving the second time not become that big of a deal? Well, I think the answer goes back to something Jesus said before he left the first time. So if we look in John chapter 16, they were eating this meal together, and Jesus tells them this: "But very truly I tell you, it is for your good that I am going away. Unless I go away, the advocate will not come to you. But if I go, I will send him to you." So what is an advocate? An advocate is somebody who is there to help you, to comfort you, and to defend you, right? They're that person that's in your corner through life. And so what Jesus was telling them is that, hey, even though I'm leaving, I'm going to send somebody else on my behalf. And that person is the Holy Spirit. You see, that same power and that same spirit that Jesus had, Jesus says, I'm going to give this gift to you, and you can have that same power also. So now, instead of it just being in Jesus, it can be everywhere. Now, just before Jesus left the second time, he reminds them of this verse that he shared with them the first time. And it's in Acts 1:8, and it says this. It says, "But you will receive power when the Holy Spirit comes upon you. And you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem and all Judea and Samaria and to the ends of the earth." So of all the things that Jesus could have reminded them of before he left, he chose to remind them that the Holy Spirit was on his way. Because even though he was leaving for a second time, he wanted them to know that they weren't going to be alone. And that's ultimately exactly what happened. This ragtag group of guys and women went on to change the world. Now here's what's so powerful about it all. That same promise that he gave to those disciples and early Jesus followers is the same promise that he gives us today. Because Easter means way more than just the resurrection. It means way more than fear isn't final or that there's new life possible. Because Easter means that you're never alone. You always have this Holy Spirit walking along with you. So just imagine for a second, what if we had that same confidence and assurance that the early disciples did about who the Holy Spirit was? Or maybe a better way to put it is, what if we actually believed that this was real? What if we truly believed that everything that Jesus did happened and that the Holy Spirit is actually living inside of us today? How would that begin to change us for a little bit? So 2 things I want to say on that. One is we would believe that we can talk to God anytime, any place, and anywhere about anything. We would have this confidence that God isn't just some off in the distance person, but he is wanting a relationship with us, and we can talk to him anytime, not just at our bedtime prayers, not just when we're praying over a meal, but anytime we can be driving down the road and I can have a conversation with God, because God is not afraid of our questions. He's not afraid of our doubts, and he wants to have communication with us. The second thing that this would do is help us realize that you are stronger than you think. When you have the Holy Spirit inside of you, helping you go through life, he gives you the courage and the strength and the power to make it through when all else seems hopeless. So when you feel like you're down in that pit and you can't get out, the Holy Spirit gives us the strength to keep fighting and to keep moving. And we can trust in that. So here's the question you need to ask yourself today. In what area of your life do you feel like you're alone? When you think of loneliness, what is it you think of? And then I want you to imagine for yourself for a second that Jesus is standing right here in front of you and he's looking you in the eyes, just like I am now. And he's saying, hey, don't worry about it. We're in this together. We're going to get through. That would be a total game changer, wouldn't it? Well, probably the greatest news that you will hear this week is that that is not something that you have to imagine, because the Holy Spirit makes that a reality. And it's because of that, and it's because of the hope that we have in Jesus and the strength and the power we have from the Holy Spirit, that we have hope and joy and peace and strength to be able to make it through when all hope seems lost, like when we're alone. That's the joy and the hope that we have in the Holy Spirit, because you are never alone.